"We don't really need you here today, Margaret," Jessica said, her voice light, almost cheerful, as if she were commenting on the weather instead of dismissing someone from their own family. And for a moment Margaret Collins thought she must have misheard, that perhaps the clatter of balloons being tied to chairs or the hum of the refrigerator in the background had distorted the words, but the way Jessica didn't look at her, didn't even pause, made it clear that she had heard exactly right, that this was intentional, deliberate, and somehow already decided long before Margaret had stepped through the front door that morning carrying a tray of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies still warm from her oven, cookies her grandson Ethan had always loved, cookies she had made for every one of his birthdays since he turned 3, back when he would run to the door and wrap his small arms around her legs, calling her Grandma Maggie, with a smile so bright it made everything else feel unimportant. But today there was no running, no laughter greeting her arrival, just the faint echo of voices from the backyard and Jessica standing in the kitchen with her perfectly arranged decorations, her clipboard, her calm authority, as if she had orchestrated every detail down to who was allowed to exist in this space and who was not. And Margaret stood there for a second longer than she should have, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the tray, as the warmth from the cookies seeped into her palms, grounding her in a moment that suddenly felt unreal, because this house, Daniel's house, had once felt like an extension of her own, a place where she could walk in without knocking, where she had spent countless afternoons babysitting Ethan, reading him stories, helping him with his homework at the kitchen table, the same table now covered with themed decorations she hadn't been asked to help choose, and she noticed then how everything already seemed complete, every balloon perfectly placed, every gift neatly stacked, every task already assigned to someone else, and the realization came quietly, not like a sharp blow but like a slow, heavy settling in her chest, that she had not been forgotten. That would have been easier to forgive. She had been intentionally excluded, carefully, systematically, in a way that made her presence unnecessary, inconvenient, almost intrusive. And still she did not argue, did not ask for an explanation, because something in Jessica's tone had made it clear that this was not a conversation but a conclusion. And Margaret had always believed that dignity was not found in raising one's voice but in knowing when to remain silent, so she simply nodded once, a small, controlled movement, as if acknowledging a simple request, even though inside her mind was already beginning to turn, to question, to search for meaning in the spaces between words, because this was not just about a birthday party, not just about a single sentence spoken too casually. This felt like the surface of something deeper. Something that had been forming quietly over time, in missed phone calls, in invitations that never came, in subtle changes she had chosen to overlook. And as she stood there, still holding the tray, she realized that whatever had just happened was not the beginning of the problem, it was only the first moment she had finally seen it clearly. Margaret did not leave right away, not because she believed she still belonged there, but because her body needed a moment longer than her mind to accept what had just happened. And so, she moved slowly toward the kitchen counter, setting the tray of cookies down with care as if nothing were out of place, as if this were just another ordinary visit. And for a brief second she allowed herself to observe the room the way she used to, noticing the details that once brought her quiet satisfaction, the polished granite countertops, the neatly arranged party favors, the faint scent of vanilla candles mixing with the sweetness of frosting from the cake already waiting in the center of the island. But something had shifted in the way the space felt, as if it no longer recognized her presence, and she realized that this was not the first time she had felt this subtle displacement, only the first time she had not been able to explain it away, because over the past year there had been small moments, easily dismissed at the time, moments that now returned to her with uncomfortable clarity, like the afternoon she had called to ask if Ethan wanted to spend the weekend at her house and Jessica had replied that they already had plans. Though Margaret later saw photos online of a quiet day at home, or the Thanksgiving when she had been told dinner would be small and intimate only, to find out afterward that several neighbors had attended, people she had never even met, and then there were the birthdays she had been invited to but not asked to help with, the gradual removal of her role piece by piece until all that remained was her presence, and even that now seemed negotiable. And as she stood there in the kitchen she could hear the faint laughter from the backyard where guests had already begun to gather, voices overlapping, children running. The sound of celebration continuing without interruption, without any sign that something had just been quietly taken away from her. And she wondered, not for the first time, when exactly the distance had begun, because it had not happened all at once. It had been slow, almost careful, like someone rearranging furniture in a room inch by inch, so that you only notice the difference when you can no longer find your place to sit. And she thought about Daniel then, about the way he had hugged her briefly at the door earlier that morning, distracted, already turning his attention back to whatever Jessica had been saying, and she tried to remember the last time he had looked at her the way he used to, with warmth, without that subtle tension that now seemed to linger in every interaction, and she felt no anger in that moment, only a quiet, unsettling awareness that something fundamental had changed in the structure of her family, something that could not be undone with a conversation or explained away with good intentions, and so instead of reaching for answers she simply stepped back, both physically and emotionally, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the counter as she took in the scene one last time. And for the first time she allowed herself to consider a possibility she had been avoiding for far too long, that she had not just been overlooked. She had been gradually and deliberately removed from a life she had once believed was permanently hers. Margaret eventually stepped out into the backyard, not because she felt welcome but because leaving too quickly would have drawn attention she did not want. And she had always believed that there was a certain strength and composure, even when everything inside felt unsettled. So she moved through the gathering with a quiet awareness, offering small polite smiles when someone happened to meet her eyes, though most did not. And she noticed how easily conversations continued around her without pause, as if her presence had already been accounted for and deemed unnecessary. And it was in those small, ordinary moments that the truth became harder to ignore, because no one asked her to help cut the cake. No one handed her a plate to pass around. No one even suggested she sit beside Ethan as he opened his gifts, a role she had filled every year without question. And when she finally spotted her grandson across the yard, surrounded by children and laughter, she felt a brief flicker of relief, thinking perhaps she could still step into that familiar place. But before she could take more than a few steps forward, Jessica appeared at his side, adjusting the arrangement of presents, guiding the flow of the moment with careful precision. And when Margaret paused within earshot she heard Jessica laugh softly as she spoke to one of the other parents, saying that everything had to be organized this year because too many people tended to complicate things, and there was something in the way she said it, light on the surface but deliberate underneath, that made Margaret stop completely, her movement interrupted not by the words themselves but by the realization that they were not meant to include her. And she stood there just long enough to notice how natural it all seemed to everyone else, how Daniel moved in and out of conversations without once glancing in her direction, how the other guests responded to Jessica as if she were the unquestioned center of the event. And Margaret understood then that this was not a misunderstanding or a single moment of insensitivity. It was a system, one that had been quietly established over time, where her role had been reduced, then minimized, and now finally erased. And yet what unsettled her most was not the absence of confrontation, but the absence of acknowledgement, because it was one thing to be pushed aside and another entirely to be made invisible. And as she stood near the edge of the yard she found herself observing rather than participating, noticing how every decision, every interaction, every small detail of the day reinforced a single, unspoken message, that she was no longer part of the structure that held this family together. And for the first time she allowed herself to stop searching for an explanation that would make it feel accidental, because there was a clarity in what she was seeing now, a pattern that could not be dismissed or softened by good intentions. And in that clarity something inside her shifted, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but in the quiet, controlled space of her own thoughts, where she began to understand that whatever had been taken from her was not going to be returned by waiting, and that perhaps the most important thing she could do in that moment was not to reclaim her place, but to step back far enough to see exactly who had decided she no longer had one. Margaret did not stay much longer after that, not because anyone asked her to leave but because she understood that remaining would not change anything. And as she walked back through the house to retrieve her purse she moved with the same measured calm she had carried throughout the afternoon, though inside her thoughts had begun to rearrange themselves in a way that felt unfamiliar. more precise, more deliberate. And as she stepped out onto the front porch and closed the door quietly behind her, she allowed herself, for the first time that day, to breathe without holding anything back, the cool air settling around her as she descended the steps and paused beside her car, her hand resting lightly on the handle as she looked out at the quiet suburban street, so different from the carefully managed celebration happening just a few yards away. And it was in that stillness that the memories began to surface, not in a chaotic rush but in a slow, orderly sequence, each one connecting to the next with a clarity that had been missing before, like pieces of a pattern she had not realized she was assembling. And she thought about the first time Jessica had gently suggested that it might be better if Margaret did not come over unannounced anymore, framing it as a need for structure, for routine, something that had seemed reasonable at the time. And then the gradual shift from weekly visits to occasional invitations, always explained with practical reasons, always delivered with that same composed tone that left no room for objection. And Margaret had accepted each change without question, believing that families evolved, that boundaries were natural, that she was respecting their space. But now, standing alone in the fading afternoon light, she could see how each adjustment had served a purpose, how each small concession had created a little more distance, a little less involvement, until what remained was something fragile and conditional, something that could be removed entirely without disruption. And she remembered the phone calls that had grown shorter, the conversations that had become more surface level, the way Daniel had started to sound distracted even when she knew he was not busy, and she realized that she had been compensating without realizing it, offering more help, more understanding, more patience, hoping to maintain a connection that was already being quietly reduced. And there was no anger in that realization, only a steady, unmistakable awareness that she had been responding to something she did not fully see, adjusting herself to fit a space that was being deliberately reshaped without her. And as she finally opened the car door and settled into the driver's seat, she sat there for a moment longer before starting the engine, her hands resting on the steering wheel as her reflection stared back at her from the windshield, not with confusion anymore but with a kind of clarity that felt both heavy and grounding, because for the first time she was no longer asking what she had done wrong or how she might fix it. She was beginning to understand that the situation had never been about a single moment or a single decision. It had been a process, one that had unfolded slowly enough to avoid resistance. And now that she could see it for what it was, she knew that whatever came next would require something different from her. Not more effort, not more patience, but a willingness to stop accepting a place that had already been taken away. Margaret drove home without turning on the radio, the silence inside the car not uncomfortable but necessary, as if any noise would interrupt the steady line of thought that had begun forming with unusual clarity. And when she pulled into her driveway, the late afternoon sun had already started to soften, casting long shadows across the front lawn that she had tended for years, a space that still felt entirely her own, unchanged and undisturbed. And as she stepped inside her house, she noticed how different the air felt compared to the carefully controlled environment she had just left. Here there was no performance, no quiet exclusion hidden beneath polite smiles, only the familiar stillness that greeted her every evening. And she placed her purse on the entry table with deliberate care before walking into the kitchen, where the absence of voices, of movement, of expectation, allowed her thoughts to settle into something more focused. And it was there, standing by the sink and looking out over the backyard she had once imagined her grandson playing in more often, that she heard her phone vibrate softly against the countertop, the sound sharp in the otherwise quiet room. And when she picked it up, she saw the name that made her pause. Helen Brooks, a neighbor from Daniel Street, someone Margaret had spoken to casually over the years but never closely. And for a brief moment she considered letting it go to voicemail, but something in the timing felt too precise to ignore. So she answered, her voice steady, measured, as she greeted her. And Helen did not waste time with small talk, her tone polite but carrying an undercurrent of hesitation, as if she had debated making the call at all. And after a brief exchange she said that she hoped she was not overstepping, that she simply felt Margaret should know something that had been mentioned more than once during neighborhood conversations, something that had not sat right with her. And Margaret listened without interrupting, her hand resting lightly against the counter as Helen explained that Jessica had on several occasions, spoken about wanting to simplify things, about reducing what she called unnecessary obligations, and while she never mentioned Margaret directly at first, the context had become clearer over time, especially when Jessica described how difficult it was to manage family expectations with someone older who, in her words, did not adapt easily to change, and there was a pause on the line after that, a quiet space where the meaning of those words settled fully, and Margaret did not react outwardly, did not question or defend. She simply absorbed the information with the same calm she had maintained all day, though inside the final piece of uncertainty began to dissolve, because this was no longer a matter of interpretation or assumption, it was confirmation, spoken indirectly but clearly enough to remove any remaining doubt, and Helen, sensing perhaps the weight of what she had shared, added that she had always thought Margaret seemed kind, present, someone deeply involved in her family, and that the way things were being described did not match that impression, and Margaret thanked her, not with emotion but with quiet sincerity, before ending the call and placing the phone back on the counter, where it remained still as the room returned to silence, and for a long moment she did not move, did not rush to respond or react, because what she felt now was not shock or even sadness, but something far more steady, a recognition that what had been happening was not subtle misunderstanding but deliberate narrative, one that had been shaped and repeated until it became accepted without question, and as she stood there she understood that this was the point where everything shifted, not outwardly, not yet, but internally, where she no longer needed to search for reasons or excuses, because the truth, once seen clearly, required a different kind of response, one that did not involve asking for space in a place that had already decided she did not belong. Margaret did not sleep much that night, not because her mind was racing in chaos but because it had settled into a quiet, deliberate rhythm that refused to be ignored, and she lay in bed staring at the ceiling as the house remained still around her, every familiar object in its place, every memory intact. Yet something fundamental had shifted in the way she saw it all, as if the life she had built and the role she believed she held within her family were no longer aligned, and sometime just before sunrise she rose from bed without hesitation, her movements calm and purposeful, as though she had already made a decision she had not yet spoken aloud, and she walked into the kitchen and began her morning routine with the same care she always had, measuring coffee grounds, filling the kettle, waiting for the quiet click that signaled the water had reached the right temperature. Small actions that grounded her in a sense of control that felt newly important. And as she stood by the window with her cup in hand, she no longer replayed the words she had heard the day before, no longer questioned their meaning or intent, because that part was already clear. What mattered now was what came next. And she understood that reacting emotionally would change nothing, that confronting Jessica directly would only give her the opportunity to reshape the narrative once again, to position Margaret as unreasonable, as difficult, as exactly what had already been suggested behind closed doors, and Margaret had no interest in reinforcing a version of herself that had been constructed without her consent, so instead she turned her attention inward, toward the practical realities she had not considered in years, and after finishing her coffee she moved with quiet precision to the small study at the back of the house where she kept her documents, a space she had not needed to access often but had always maintained with care, and she opened the drawer where she kept her financial records, her will, the documents her late husband had insisted be organized clearly and securely, and as she reviewed each paper she felt a steady clarity take hold, not driven by fear but by awareness, because for the first time she considered the possibility that the distance being created was not only emotional but could, over time, extend into decisions about her future, her assets, her independence, and she realized that waiting passively would not protect anything, that understanding and preparation were the only responses that made sense now, and she made a quiet decision then, not one that required announcement or approval, but one that shifted her role entirely, from someone reacting to circumstances to someone defining them, and as she closed the drawer and straightened the papers neatly into place she felt no anger, no urgency, only a calm resolve that what she would do next would not be visible immediately, would not disrupt the surface of anything that had been built around her, but would instead take shape beneath it, quietly, deliberately, in a way that could not be undone once it was complete. Margaret did not announce any of the changes she began to make over the following days, not to Daniel, not to anyone, because she understood now that visibility had never worked in her favor, and instead she moved through her routines with the same calm consistency she had always shown, answering calls when they came, responding politely to messages, even agreeing to a brief lunch with Daniel later that week when he suggested it with a tone that felt more like obligation than intention, and she accepted without hesitation, not because she believed it would repair anything but because she wanted to observe, to confirm what she had already begun to understand. And when they met, at a small cafe halfway between their homes, she noticed immediately how carefully neutral his demeanor had become, how his words stayed on safe topics, work, traffic, the weather, as if anything deeper might disrupt a balance he was trying to maintain. And Margaret did not push, did not question him about the party or Jessica or anything that might force him into discomfort, because she no longer needed explanations from someone who had already chosen silence, and instead she listened, nodded, and allowed the conversation to unfold exactly as he needed it to, while quietly noting what was not being said. And when the check arrived he reached for it quickly, almost reflexively, and she let him, recognizing the gesture for what it was, not generosity but distance disguised as courtesy. And when they parted he hugged her briefly, his hand resting on her shoulder for a moment that felt practiced rather than natural, and she returned the gesture with the same measured warmth she had always given, though inside there was no longer any expectation attached to it. And later that afternoon, back in her own home, she continued with the quiet steps she had set in motion, scheduling an appointment with a financial advisor she trusted, reviewing account access, confirming details that had once seemed unimportant because she had believed her place in the family was secure. And as she worked through each task she felt the same steady clarity guiding her decisions, not driven by fear or urgency but by a recognition that control, once given away without question, was not easily returned, and she had no intention of leaving anything uncertain anymore. And what made the process feel almost effortless was the absence of hesitation, because for the first time she was not trying to preserve a version of her life that no longer existed. She was simply adjusting to what had already changed. And as the days passed nothing outward shifted. No confrontation. No raised voices. No visible conflict. Only the quiet continuation of a routine that appeared unchanged to anyone looking from the outside. And yet beneath that surface Margaret had already stepped into a different role entirely, one that no longer depended on acceptance, invitation, or approval. And it was in that quiet transformation that the balance had begun to shift, not in a way anyone else could see yet, but in a way that would, eventually, make itself impossible to ignore. Margaret's next steps unfolded with a quiet precision that even she had not fully anticipated. Not because she had become someone different but because she had finally stopped delaying decisions she should have made long ago. And over the following week she met with her attorney, a man who had known her and her late husband for years, someone who did not ask unnecessary questions but listened carefully as she outlined what she wanted to review. And there was no mention of conflict, no dramatic explanation, only a series of practical adjustments that, on the surface, appeared routine, yet carried a significance that Margaret understood completely. And as they sat across from each other in the small office lined with neatly organized files, she spoke calmly about updating her will, clarifying beneficiaries, and ensuring that her assets would be managed according to her own intentions without ambiguity or external influence. And the attorney nodded, making notes, occasionally asking for confirmation, but never once expressing surprise, as if he recognized the moment for what it was, not a reaction but a recalibration. And when the documents were placed in front of her she read each line carefully, not out of doubt but out of respect for the finality of what she was choosing. And then she signed them with a steady hand, the simple motion carrying more weight than anything she had said aloud in weeks. And afterward she left the office without any sense of relief or regret, only a quiet acknowledgement that something essential had been secured. And in the days that followed she continued to move through her life with the same outward calm, answering Daniel's occasional messages with polite brevity, declining invitations she no longer felt obligated to accept. And when Jessica sent a brief note asking if Margaret might be available to watch Ethan for a few hours the following weekend, Margaret responded kindly but firmly that she had other plans, a statement that required no further explanation, and it was in that moment, small and easily overlooked, that the shift became unmistakable, not because of the words themselves but because of what they represented, a boundary that had not existed before, one that did not seek approval or permission, and as she set her phone down she felt no satisfaction in the refusal, no desire to assert control, only a sense of balance that had been absent for longer than she had realized, and she spent that afternoon tending to her garden, trimming back the overgrown branches, clearing space for new growth, the simple act mirroring something deeper that was taking place within her, a process of removing what no longer belonged in order to make room for what did. And as the sun began to set she paused to look at the work she had done, not with pride but with clarity, because she understood now that change did not always arrive with confrontation or conflict. Sometimes it came quietly, through decisions made without announcement, through actions that spoke more clearly than words ever could. And while nothing had yet been revealed, nothing had been challenged or questioned, the foundation beneath everything had already shifted. And when the time came for that shift to be seen, it would not require explanation, because it would already be complete. The moment it became visible did not arrive with confrontation or raised voices, but with something far quieter and far more definitive. And it happened on a Sunday afternoon when Daniel and Jessica arrived at Margaret's house unannounced, their expressions carrying a mixture of expectation and subtle urgency, as if they had rehearsed a conversation they believed would unfold in a predictable way. And Margaret welcomed them in with the same composed warmth she had always shown, offering coffee, gesturing toward the living room, allowing the setting to remain calm and familiar even as she sensed the purpose behind their visit. And it was Jessica who spoke first, her tone carefully measured, explaining that they had been thinking about the future, about planning ahead, about ensuring everything was organized in a way that would make things easier for everyone. And Daniel nodded beside her, adding that it was simply about being practical, about making sure there were no complications later on. And Margaret listened without interruption, her attention steady, her expression neutral, as she recognized the language for what it was, not concern but positioning. And when Jessica mentioned the idea of consolidating certain assets, of streamlining responsibilities, of possibly adjusting living arrangements down the line, Margaret did not respond immediately. She simply reached for the folder she had placed on the side table earlier that morning, a quiet preparation that now revealed its purpose, and she handed it to Daniel with a calm that did not invite debate. And as he opened it his expression shifted almost instantly, the practiced certainty replaced by something less stable, something closer to realization, because inside were the finalized documents, clearly outlined, professionally executed, leaving no ambiguity about Margaret's decisions, her assets secured under her direct control, her beneficiaries defined according to her own judgment, her future structured in a way that required no external management. And Jessica leaned forward slightly, her composure tightening as she tried to follow what Daniel was reading, and for a moment there was silence, not the polite kind that fills conversation, but the kind that signals a shift no one had anticipated. And Margaret allowed that silence to remain, because there was nothing she needed to explain, nothing she needed to justify. And when Daniel finally looked up, his voice uncertain as he asked when all of this had been arranged, Margaret answered simply that it had already been taken care of, that everything was exactly as it needed to be. And there was no accusation in her tone, no reference to past events, only a calm statement of fact that left no room for reinterpretation. And Jessica attempted to respond, to reframe the conversation, but the foundation she had relied on was no longer there. And Margaret could see it in the subtle shift of her posture, the way her certainty no longer held. And after a few more attempts at conversation that led nowhere, Daniel stood, thanking his mother in a voice that carried a weight he had not brought with him. And as they left, Margaret walked them to the door, offering the same polite farewell she had always given. And when the door closed behind them she did not linger, did not reflect. She simply turned back into her home, the space around her unchanged yet entirely her own. And in that quiet she understood that nothing had been taken back, nothing had been restored, but something far more important had been established, a boundary that did not depend on recognition, a position that did not require validation. And for the first time in a long while, Margaret was no longer standing at the edge of someone else's decisions. She was firmly, unmistakably, at the center of her own.